Welcome. For this explainer, we're jumping right into a devotional text that tackles a really big idea: how salvation is said to create a deep, lasting peace with God. We're going to break down all the core concepts, from the problem it addresses to the solution it offers, and what that all means for daily life. So let's start with a feeling I think a lot of us might know. Have you ever had that sense of restlessness deep down, a kind of inner turmoil that just won't go away no matter what you accomplish? Well, our source material zeroes in on this as a central human experience it wants to talk about. So what's really behind that feeling? In this first part, we're going to dig into the source's diagnosis for why this inner turmoil feels so universal. According to the text, this isn't just some psychological quirk. The core argument here is that there's a spiritual barrier, what it calls sin, that creates a fundamental separation from God. And it's this separation, the text argues, that leads to those feelings of fear, guilt, and that deep, nagging restlessness. So the source really lays out two completely different ways of being. On one side, you've got separation, and that's defined by things like fear, guilt, and turmoil. But on the other side, you have reconciliation, which brings confidence, favor, and a sense of stability. This contrast perfectly sets up the problem that the rest of the text is trying to solve. Okay, so if separation is the problem, what's the answer? This next section is all about how the source claims that spiritual barrier can actually be broken down, leading to that state of reconciliation. And here it is. This is the foundational verse for the entire devotional. Romans 5:1 is presented as the absolute pillar of the whole argument. The two key phrases to lock onto here are justified by faith and peace with God, because in this view, they are totally linked. So what does justify by faith really mean, according to this text? Well, the source breaks it down as a moment where a person is reconciled, made right with God, simply through belief. It's an act that's said to completely wipe away condemnation and restore that broken relationship. Now, the source makes a really crucial point here. The peace it's talking about isn't just, the lack of conflict or a temporary feeling of calm. It's defined as something way more concrete, a positive, active spiritual reality that comes from being reconnected with God. To make this pretty abstract idea of reconciliation feel a bit more real, the devotional pulls in a famous story. In this section, we'll see exactly how the parable of the prodigal son is used to paint a picture of what this divine peace actually looks like. You can see how the story follows a path that really mirrors the spiritual journey being described. First, you have the son's wayward journey. That's the separation. Then comes that critical moment when he decides to return home. And he's met not with judgment, but with his father's immediate, open-armed acceptance. And boom, right there, through that acceptance, peace is totally restored. The source draws a really clear line connecting the story to the theology. The wayward son, that's meant to represent humanity separated by sin. The Father's unconditional welcome, that's a picture of God's acceptance through salvation. And that restored relationship they have at the end, that's the peace and intimacy the text is all about. All right, we've gone through the problem, the proposed solution, and even an illustration. But what does all of this actually do? What does it look like in real life? This last section digs into the practical, on-the-ground outcomes that the source says come from having this divine peace. According to the text, this peace isn't just some abstract feeling. It becomes a foundation that empowers your life in some really tangible ways. It's said to give you resilience because, well, when the ultimate fear of judgment is gone, other struggles seem smaller. That security is also said to bring clarity to your decisions, a deep confidence in your purpose, and a new kind of freedom to serve others and even to forgive. So if there's one major takeaway here, it's this. The devotional paints this peace as anything but passive. It's described as an active, empowering force, a solid foundation you can actually build a transformed and purposeful life on. And that brings us to the final thought our source material leaves us with. It suggests that real peace isn't something you go out and find, like a treasure hunt, but something that gets restored through this reconciliation, which leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. What does a life that's actually built on that kind of restored foundation truly look like? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down a devotional text that gets right to the heart of a pretty fundamental human quest, the search for joy. We'll be distilling its core message about the relationship between salvation and a kind of joy that's said to withstand, well, just about anything. Okay, let's dive right in. We're starting with a question that, let's be honest, probably resonates with every single one of us. The source material we're looking at today uses this exact question as its launchpad, framing it as a central human problem, especially in a world that's just full of temporary fixes. So the text we're breaking down is this daily devotional, and it doesn't just ask the question, it provides a very definitive answer. It argues that lasting joy feels so out of reach because, to put it simply, we're looking for it in all the wrong places. According to the author, we tend to chase happiness through these kinds of external channels, right? What we own, who we're with, what we manage to accomplish. But the text is really quick to point out that, yeah, these things can bring us moments of happiness, but that feeling is often super fleeting and really depends on our circumstances staying perfect. And this brings us to the real core of the source's argument. It basically asks us to consider a completely different framework, to step away from the idea of happiness as we know it and move toward what it calls a totally different kind of joy. So here, the author draws a really clear line in the sand. Happiness, that's presented as something external, something conditional. Joy, on the other hand, is defined as internal, something that lasts, and something that's completely independent of what's going on around you. You know, this distinction, it's the bedrock of the entire message. And here it is, the text's central concept. It defines this special kind of joy as an ongoing spiritual experience. See, it's not a feeling you have to chase down, but a state of being that the author claims is a direct result of salvation. It's rooted in that internal assurance of faith, not in getting a thumbs up from the outside world. Now, to ground this whole idea, the author turns to scripture, specifically this verse from the Gospel of John. The text interprets this not as some kind of wish, but as a promise, suggesting that this complete, lasting joy is an intended and totally accessible outcome for believers. So, theory is one thing, right? But how does the source show this concept working in the real world? Well, it does it with a pretty dramatic historical account. The text really puts its money where its mouth is with this story from the book of Acts. I mean, the conditions could not be worse. The characters have been beaten up and are now literally imprisoned. By any normal measure, these guys should be absolutely miserable. And boom, this is what brilliantly illustrates the source's point. Instead of despair, what do you get? Prayer and songs of praise. According to the author, their internal spiritual state completely overrode their bleak external reality. This is presented as joy in action. So the crucial point the author is making is this. Their joy wasn't about them denying their suffering. No way. It was a direct product of their faith in spite of their suffering. Their salvation, the text argues, gave them a totally different perspective and an inner strength that their circumstances just couldn't touch. From there, the devotional kind of shifts gears from explaining the what to detailing the how. It moves from this big theological concept to what it calls a life application, offering readers a pretty clear path to start cultivating this internal joy for themselves. The process laid out is a very conscious 3-step practice. First, you've got self-examination. You got to figure out where your joy is really coming from right now. Second, there's a verbal declaration of faith. And third, it's about making a deliberate choice to act from a place of joy, no matter how you're feeling or what your situation is. And the text claims that if you do this, it has very real, tangible effects. It's not just about feeling better. This joy is said to bring inner peace, strengthen your own faith, act as a powerful testimony to other people, and give you the spiritual gear you need to get through the tough times. Finally, the devotional reveals that this whole thing isn't just supposed to be an individual exercise. The ultimate goal here is to build a community around this shared experience. Yeah, it becomes really clear that the message is designed to be a starting point. The author's goal is to move the reader from just, intellectually understanding this concept to actively participating within a specific faith-based mission. The text then lays out several different roles for anyone who feels compelled to join its Operation 500 Million Souls for Christ mission. The invitation is very clear. You can get involved through prayer, through direct service, or through financial support. And a pretty big chunk of the source material is actually dedicated to these digital platforms. It really shows a modern approach to ministry, using a huge array of social media and messaging apps to create and sustain this global, connected community around the clock. And all of this, everything we've talked about, it all leads to a very specific call to action. The devotional presents this prayer of salvation as the foundational step. It's the key that unlocks the door to that salvation-driven joy that the entire text has been describing. So, to wrap this all up, the core argument of this source is really a radical redefinition of joy. It separates that common chase for event-driven happiness from the cultivation of an internal, constant, faith-based joy that it claims is accessible to everyone through salvation. And that leaves us with the central question this text really wants us to think about. It challenges us to consider whether our deepest sense of well-being is something we have to find out there in the world, or if it's actually something we build and cultivate on the inside.